It didn't begin with an explosion. It began with silence. At first, nothing seemed different. Oil tankers slowed, then stopped. Satellite images revealed a strange pattern, ships drifting just outside the Strait of Hormuz, unwilling to move forward. Then the announcement came. Iran had closed the strait. A narrow stretch of water, barely 33 kilometers wide, suddenly became the most important, and most dangerous, place on Earth. Nearly 20% of the world's oil flowed through this corridor, and now it was sealed. Within hours, global markets reacted. Oil prices surged. Shipping insurance skyrocketed. Governments moved behind closed doors, trying to understand what came next. But this wasn't just about energy. This was leverage. By closing Hormuz, Iran wasn't trying to start a war, it was trying to control the terms of one without firing a single shot. And for the United States, the implications were immediate. If the strait remained closed, the global economy would begin to bleed. Allies would panic. Pressure would build. Doing nothing was not an option. But acting meant stepping into a battlefield that Iran had been preparing for decades. Because while the world was focused on the surface, something far more dangerous had already been set in motion beneath it. And the moment the US Navy decided to move, there would be no turning back. On paper, the US Navy is unstoppable. Carrier strike groups, guided missile destroyers, submarines that can disappear beneath the ocean for months, and no other force comes close. But the Strait of Hormuz was never meant to be fought on paper. It was designed by geography to neutralize power. At its narrowest point, it compresses fleets into predictable paths, forcing even the most advanced warships into confined lanes where maneuverability disappears. And Iran has spent decades turning that natural bottleneck into something far more dangerous. This wasn't a last-minute defense. It was a system. Along the northern coastline, hidden among mountains and reinforced bunkers, sit layers of anti-ship missile batteries, some mobile, some buried, all networked. They don't need to be perfect. They just need to fire in waves. Behind them, radar stations scan constantly, feeding data into a decentralized command structure designed to survive even under heavy bombardment. Destroy one node, and another takes its place. But the real threat isn't what can be seen. It's what can't. Beneath the surface lies a scattered field of naval mines, some anchored, some drifting, some intelligent enough to detect the acoustic signature of specific ships. They don't announce themselves. They don't need guidance. They wait. And clearing them isn't just slow, it's nearly impossible under active threat. Every minute spent removing a mine is a minute exposed to missiles, drones, and attack boats. And then there are the swarms. Hundreds of small, fast vessels, built not for endurance but for speed and unpredictability. They don't operate like a traditional navy. They don't form lines or follow formations. They scatter, regroup, and strike from multiple directions at once. Individually, they are weak. Together, they create chaos, forcing advanced systems to track too many targets at the same time. This is the core of Iran's strategy. Not to defeat the US Navy in open combat, but to break its advantages. To turn precision into confusion. To turn speed into hesitation. To turn power into vulnerability. Because in the Strait of Hormuz, the question isn't whether the US Navy can win. It's whether it can operate at all. And the moment the first ship crosses into that narrow corridor, every system, every sensor, every decision becomes part of a much larger equation, one that Iran has been solving for years. The trap isn't a single weapon. It's the environment itself. And once you're inside it, you're already playing by someone else's rules. Long before the first US ship moved into the strait, the battle had already begun, it just wasn't happening where anyone could see it. Hundreds of miles away, beneath the deck of an aircraft carrier, pilots prepared in silence, receiving coordinates that had been selected days, sometimes weeks in advance. When the first aircraft launched, it didn't mark the start of war, it confirmed that the war had already been calculated. Stealth fighters moved first, flying low and slipping through carefully mapped gaps in Iran's radar coverage, while electronic warfare aircraft followed close behind, not to destroy but to disrupt, jamming signals, distorting radar images, and creating false targets across the defense network. For a brief moment, the battlefield became uncertain, and in modern warfare, uncertainty is power, because if Iran couldn't see clearly, it couldn't respond accurately. Then the strikes began, precision-guided munitions hitting radar installations, disabling communication nodes, and targeting mobile missile launches the moment they paused. Every move was part of a sequence designed not to destroy everything, but to break the system that connected it all, because a missile without targeting data is useless, and a defense network without communication becomes fragmented. But Iran had anticipated this, building a decentralized structure designed to survive disruption, where units operated independently and commanders acted without waiting for orders. When one radar went down, another filled the gap, and when communication was lost, pre-planned responses took over. This wasn't a system that collapsed under pressure, it adapted to it. And as the US continued its strikes, something unexpected happened. There was no immediate retaliation. No overwhelming counterattack, no visible escalation, just silence. And that silence was more dangerous than any missile, because while an immediate response can be predicted, a delayed one creates uncertainty. Along the coastline, launchers were repositioning, drone operators were waiting, and fast attack boats remained hidden with engines off, nearly invisible. Iran wasn't reacting, it was choosing the moment. Because this phase of the conflict was never about who could strike harder, it was about who could control the pace, and as the US Navy prepared to enter the strait, Iran was preparing something far more dangerous than a direct attack. It was preparing timing, and in a battlefield this tight, timing doesn't just shape the fight, it decides who survives the first engagement. The response didn't come all at once, it came in fragments, almost invisible at first. A radar ping here, a brief signal spike there, nothing that looked like a full-scale attack. And that was exactly the point. Iran wasn't trying to overwhelm the US Navy immediately, it was trying to stretch its attention, to force every system to stay active, every sensor to stay locked, every crew to remain on edge. Then, without warning, the first wave appeared. Not missiles, drones. Dozens of them, small, fast, and low, approaching from multiple directions at once. They weren't built to destroy destroyers, they were built to trigger defenses, to force the Navy to reveal its positions, to drain its interceptors, and to create noise inside the system. And as the drones filled the sky, the real attack followed. Missiles launched from the coastline, flying low over the water, using terrain and speed to minimize detection time. At the same moment, fast attack boats surged forward from hidden positions, splitting into groups, changing direction unpredictably, closing distance faster than traditional naval tactics would ever allow. This wasn't a coordinated strike in the conventional sense, it was controlled chaos. Every layer designed to interfere with the others, forcing the US Navy to process too many threats at once. Advanced radar systems tracked hundreds of objects simultaneously, but tracking wasn't the problem, decision-making was. Which targets mattered? Which ones were decoys? Which ones were already too close? Because in a saturated environment, even the most advanced systems begin to slow down. And that delay, even if it's measured in seconds, is enough. The destroyers responded instantly, interceptors launching into the air, close-in weapon systems activating, turning the sky into a storm of explosions and tracer fire. One by one, threats were eliminated. But not all of them. Because Iran's strategy was never about perfect accuracy, it was about probability. It didn't need every missile to hit. It didn't need every drone to survive. It just needed enough pressure, enough confusion, enough overlap to create a single opening. And somewhere in that chaos, something always gets through. A missile that flies just below detection for 1 second too long. A drone that slips past a defense system already engaged. A fast boat that closes the final distance before being targeted. This is the moment Iran has been building toward, not a decisive victory, but a moment of vulnerability. Because against a force as powerful as the US Navy, you don't defeat it head-on. You force it into a position where its advantages begin to break down. And in the narrow waters of the strait, surrounded, compressed, and under constant pressure, even the most advanced fleet in the world begins to feel something it was never designed for. Not defeat, but uncertainty. At first, it looked like everything was under control. Every incoming threat was tracked, categorized, and engaged with precision. Interceptors launched exactly on time, close-in weapon systems lit up the sky, and drones were shredded before they could get close. On the surface, the US Navy was doing what it was designed to do, absorbing pressure and maintaining dominance. But control comes with a hidden weakness: it creates patterns, and patterns can be studied, predicted, and exploited. As the engagement intensified, defense systems began prioritizing threats based on speed, trajectory, and probability of impact, engaging the fastest and closest targets first while calculating the rest. It was efficient, almost flawless, but not every incoming object was meant to hit. Some were designed to be seen. A wave of drones surged toward one destroyer, drawing multiple interceptors and forcing its systems to commit resources. At the same time, fast attack boats approached from a different angle, forcing radar systems to split attention. Signals overlapped, targeting queues filled, and for a brief moment, the system reached its limit. Not failure, not collapse, just hesitation. A fraction of a second where too many decisions had to be made at once. And in that fraction, something slipped through. A low-flying missile, masked by the surface of the sea and perfectly timed with the distraction, remained undetected just long enough. By the time it was clearly identified, it was already inside the reaction window. Defensive systems responded instantly, interceptors fired, guns turned, but reaction is never as fast as anticipation. The margin was gone. The missile struck. Not enough to destroy the ship, not enough to cause catastrophic damage, but enough to change everything. Systems were disrupted, coordination faltered for a moment, and more importantly, a boundary had been crossed. Because the question was never whether the US Navy could survive a hit, it was whether it could maintain control. And now, control was no longer guaranteed. The fleet adjusted, recalibrating positions and defenses, but every movement now carried doubt. Every radar contact became a potential threat. Every delay became a risk. Iran hadn't overwhelmed the fleet, it had done something far more dangerous: it had proven that even the most advanced system could be penetrated. And once that possibility becomes real, the battlefield changes, because from that moment forward, the US Navy wasn't just fighting the enemy, it was fighting uncertainty. But the missile strike wasn't the most dangerous part of the battle. It was just the beginning. Because the real threat in the Strait of Hormuz isn't what moves through the air, it's what waits below the surface. Invisible, silent, and impossible to predict, naval mines began to turn the battlefield into something far more restrictive than any missile attack. Unlike drones or rockets, mines don't announce themselves. They don't need guidance, they don't rely on timing, and they don't miss. They wait. Some are simple, triggered by contact, while others are far more advanced, designed to detect the acoustic or magnetic signature of specific ships. And once they are deployed, they don't just create danger, they create hesitation. Because every movement now carries risk. Every meter forward could be the last. The US Navy's advantage has always been mobility, the ability to move freely, reposition quickly, and control distance. But in a mined environment, mobility disappears. Ships slow down, formations tighten, and routes become predictable. And predictability is exactly what Iran needs. Clearing mines isn't a quick solution. It requires specialized vessels, slow scanning operations, and precise removal under constant threat. And while those operations take place, the fleet remains exposed. Missiles can still be launched. Drones can still swarm. Fast attack boats can still close distance. The battlefield doesn't pause for mine clearance, it intensifies around it. This creates a dangerous imbalance. Move too fast, and risk hitting a mine. Move too slow, and become an easier target. There is no safe option, only calculated risk. And that is where the environment itself becomes the weapon. Iran doesn't need to land continuous strikes if it can force the US Navy into hesitation. Because hesitation breaks tempo, and tempo is what maintains control. The moment a fleet slows down, the initiative shifts. And in the confined waters of the strait, surrounded on all sides, even the most advanced navy in the world begins to lose the one advantage it relies on most: freedom of movement. This is the real battlefield, not the sky filled with missiles, not the surface crowded with boats, but the unseen layer beneath it all. Because in the end, the side that controls movement doesn't just control the fight. It controls whether the fight can continue at all. At this point, it becomes clear that forcing a direct path through the strait is no longer the objective. The US Navy isn't losing, but it isn't operating freely either. And in a conflict like this, limited freedom is a liability. So the strategy begins to shift, not in firepower, but in approach. Instead of pushing deeper into the most contested zones, the fleet starts to pull back slightly, creating distance while maintaining pressure. Air power increases, with more sorties launched from carriers beyond the immediate threat range, striking deeper into Iran's coastal infrastructure. The focus changes from reacting to threats, to reducing their ability to exist at all. Missile sites are hunted continuously, not just when they fire, but before they can reposition. Drone launch areas are identified and targeted. Supply lines, command nodes, and staging zones begin to disappear one by one. This isn't about eliminating every threat, it's about thinning the environment. At the same time, specialized mine countermeasure units move in, carefully and methodically, clearing narrow corridors rather than entire areas. The goal isn't to make the strait safe, it's to make it passable. Just enough space for movement. Just enough certainty to reduce hesitation. And that changes the equation. Because once controlled movement becomes possible, even in limited form, the US Navy begins to regain its most critical advantage, tempo. Operations become more deliberate, more calculated, less reactive. Instead of responding to Iran's timing, the US begins to impose its own. Strikes are no longer tied to immediate threats but planned in sequences, shaping the battlefield over time. Iran still has the ability to disrupt, but disruption alone is no longer enough. Because the battlefield is no longer defined by chaos, it's being slowly restructured. This is where the conflict stops looking like a direct confrontation and starts becoming something else entirely. A contest of endurance. A balance between pressure and patience. Because the US doesn't need to dominate every inch of the strait, it just needs to keep it open. And as long as even a narrow path remains under control, the strategic objective begins to hold. Not through overwhelming force, but through sustained presence. And in a conflict built on denial, persistence becomes the most powerful weapon of all. But as the battlefield stabilizes, a new risk begins to emerge, one that cannot be controlled by ships, missiles, or air power. Because the longer the conflict continues, the harder it becomes to keep it contained. What began as a naval operation to reopen a shipping route is now something much more fragile, balanced on a line that is starting to break. Iran doesn't need to win in the strait if it can expand the fight beyond it. And slowly, almost quietly, that expansion begins. Proxy forces activate across the region, targeting infrastructure, shipping lanes, and allied positions. Missiles don't just threaten the strait anymore, they begin to appear in neighboring territories. Cyber attacks disrupt logistics, communications, and financial systems, creating pressure far beyond the battlefield. And suddenly, the conflict is no longer isolated. It's spreading. For the United States, this creates a strategic dilemma. Escalate, and risk turning a limited operation into a full-scale regional war. Hold back, and allow Iran to widen the battlefield on its own terms. Every response now carries consequences that extend far beyond the strait. Because modern conflicts don't stay contained, they ripple outward, pulling in new actors, new fronts, and new uncertainties. And the more layers that are added, the harder it becomes to control the outcome. At the same time, global pressure begins to build. Markets react again. Allies demand stability. Diplomatic channels open and close in rapid succession, each attempting to prevent the situation from crossing a point of no return. But on the ground, or more accurately, at sea, decisions are still being made in real time, where hesitation can be just as dangerous as escalation. And this is where the conflict becomes most unstable. Not at the moment of attack, not during the peak of chaos, but in the space between control and collapse. Because both sides understand something critical, neither wants a full-scale war, but neither can afford to step back first. And in that tension, the risk isn't just miscalculation, it's inevitability. Because once a conflict reaches this level of complexity, it's no longer driven by a single objective. It's driven by momentum. And momentum is unpredictable. It can stabilize a situation, or push it over the edge. And in the narrow waters of the Strait of Hormuz, where every move is amplified and every delay matters, the difference between containment and escalation becomes almost invisible. And once that line disappears, so does control.